in the heart of the Wild West, where lawmen wore badges and outlaws ruled the land. One gang struck fear into the hearts of many. Their name, the Deadly Dalton Gang. Ruthless, cunning, and on the run, they were a force to be reckoned with. Their crime sprees stretched from the banks of Coffeyville to the rails of the Santa Fe. With guns blazing and a price on their heads, they left a trail of chaos in their wake. Join us as we dive into the gripping saga of the Dalton Gang, their daring heists, and their ultimate showdown with the law. Get ready for the Deadly Dalton Gang. The Wild West, like you've never seen it before. Remember to hit that subscribe button and like the video if you're loving the content. Your support means the world to us. The Dalton Gang was an outlaw group that operated mainly in Oklahoma and Kansas between 1890 and 1892. They are also known as the Dalton Brothers because the three members of this group were brothers. The gang specializes in robbing banks and trains. The Dalton brothers were once on the side of the law but turned outlaws in the 1890s, some of whom were killed in Coffeyville, Kansas, in a daring double bank. The Dalton brothers are members of a large family headed by parents Adeline Younger Dalton and James Lewis Dalton. Lewis Dalton came from Kentucky to Missouri in the late 1840s, and by the 1850s, he was trading horses and running a tavern in Westport, Missouri, now Kansas City, when he married Adeline. Adeline's brother is the father of Bob Younger, Cole Younger, and James Younger. Most of their 15 children were born in Missouri before the family immigrated to the Indian Territory, Oklahoma, in 1882. In 1886, they moved again to a location near Coffeyville, Kansas. In this harsh and barbaric region, the Dalton brothers inherited a tradition of violence in the bloody terrain of the Missouri-Kansas border, where the Quantrill's Raiders and other guerrilla bands were active before and during the Civil War. When the Oklahoma Territory opened to settlers in 1889, the family headed south again. However, Lewis died en route, leaving Adeline to raise her young children alone. Adeline went on to file a claim on the banks of Kingfisher Creek in Indian Territory, where she and her family initially lived in a canoe. At this time, the Dalton brothers were alone. For a short time, the brothers served in law as deputy marshals of the United States. Their brother, Frank Dalton, was appointed deputy marshal of the federal court of Fort Smith, Arkansas, and Bob Dalton served in some of his armies. On November 27, 1887, during a gunfight with the Smith-Dixon gang, Frank Dalton was shot and killed in the line of duty. Grat Dalton followed in Frank's footsteps, taking up his first position as deputy marshal at Fort Smith, Arkansas, and 2 years later as deputy marshal of Muskogee Court in the Indian Territory in 1889. That same year, he was shot in hand while trying to arrest an Indian man. Suspect Bob Dalton, who later became the leader of the Dalton Gang, was the craziest of the bunch. When he was just 19 years old, he killed a man because he thought it was while on duty. However, some suspect that the victim was trying to take Bob's daughter away. While Emmett Dalton was a member of some of his brother's bands, he made a living as a cowboy at Bar X Bar Ranch near Pawnee Agency in what is now the Osage Nation. While working on the farm, Emmett met two men who later became members of the gang, Bill Doolin and William St. Power, aka Bill Power. Power, also known as Tom Evans, who drifted into the area from Texas with a herd of Pecos. Emmett also knew several other cowboys who worked on nearby farms, who later became members of the gang. These include Charlie Pierce, George Bitter Creek Newcomb, Bill Eckelhaney, Charlie Bryant, and Richard Dick Broadwell, a.k.a. Texas Jack and John Moore. Charlie Pierce was originally from the Blue River region of Missouri, but went to the Indian Territory to avoid jail time for smuggling whiskey. Dick Broadwell came from a prominent family near Hutchinson, Kansas, and when the Oklahoma Territory opened, he claimed property in the Cowboy Flats area. There, he meets a young woman who owns a farm next door and proposes to her. After they were married, she convinced him to sell the two agents and moved with her to Fort Worth, Texas, where she disappeared with their money. Broadwell, bitterly, returned to the Indian Territory and began working on livestock farms. George Newcomb, better known as Bitter Creek Newcomb, is from Fort Scott, Kansas. Starting his cowboy career at the age of 12, he worked for C. Massacre at Long S Ranch in Texas before drifting into Indian Territory. Charlie Bryant is from Wise County, Texas. He suffered a gunpowder burn on his cheek, which earned him the nickname Black-Faced Charlie. For a short time, the Dalton brothers served with excellence on the side of justice. But a narrow gulf separates lawless people from law enforcement in these challenging times. Sliding from side to side, Bob Dalton and his brother Emmett were accused of selling whiskey in the Osage Nation on March 21, 1890. Jumping on bail, Bob and Emmett head to New Mexico. Forming their first gang, Bob recruited George Bitter Creek Newcomb, Bill Eckelhaney, and Blackface Charlie Bryant to accompany them. It was at a gambling den in Silver City, New Mexico, that the Dalton gang committed the first robbery. After entering the mining camp, the group sat down to play faro and they lost badly. Convinced that the game is torture, they pull out their guns, get back what they've lost, and more. Bob and Emmett then fled to California, where their younger brother Bill was a successful farmer and rancher. In September 1890, Grat was arrested for stealing a horse, but was later released for lack of evidence. Grat lost his position as deputy marshal for inappropriate behavior towards an officer, but he remained band leader for other deputy marshals in the region for a time. Later, he also left the Indian Territory to go with his brothers to California. Bill's anger towards the railroad industry is said to be one of the reasons why the brothers decided to rob a South Pacific train bound for Los Angeles on February 6, 1891. Prior to this robbery, Bill did not, having trouble with the law. Bill, along with Bob, Grat, and Emmett tried to hold the train in Elila, California, but this first robbery failed. While Bill prevented the passengers from interfering by shooting them over the head, the others forced the engineer to show them the location of the Cash Express. When the engineer, a man named George Radcliffe, tried to flee, he was shot dead. After finding the express car on his own, the guard refused to open the heavy door and began shooting at them. Depressed, the brothers eventually gave up and left. Bob and Emmett then fled California with a group that followed them. However, Grat and Bill were arrested. Bob and Emmett return to Indian Territory and reunite with old friends on the farm of Emmett, Charlie Bryant, and Bitter Creek Newcomb. In May 1891, 4 men hijacked ships in Wharton, Indian Territory, taking $1,745. Meanwhile, in California, Emmett Dalton was convicted of a train robbery on July 3, 1891, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. 3 months after Wharton's flight in August 1891, Charlie Bryant fell ill and was taken to a doctor in Hennessy, Oklahoma Territory. At the scene, Deputy Field Marshal Ed Short arrested Bryant while he was convalescing at a local hotel. Since there was no prison in Hennessy, the Field Marshal took Bryant on board and went to the federal prison in Wichita. Along the way, Bryant obtained a gun and had attempted to escape. In the ensuing gunfight between Bryant and Short, both men were killed by each other's gunfire. The Dalton gang's next robbery was on the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad at Lelietta, near Wagoner in the Indian Territory. Along with Bob and Emmett were Bitter Creek Newcomb, Bill Power, Dick Broadwell, Charlie Pierce, and Bill Doolin. On the night of September 15, 1891, they stopped and boarded the MK&T train and stole $2,500 from the express. Back in California on September 18, Grat escaped while on the train that took him to prison. According to one account, Grat was handcuffed to one of the 2 deputies accompanying him. While one of the deputies was asleep and the other was busy talking to other passengers, Grat stole the key to the handcuffs and jumped out of the window of the moving ship, landing in the San Joaquin River. Grat returned to Oklahoma and soon joined the gang, while his brother Bill remained in California awaiting trial. Finally, Bill Dalton was acquitted on October 10, 1891 for train robbery, for which Grat was sentenced to 20 years in prison. In the winter of 1891, the Dalton brothers were relatively quiet, but as soon as spring arrived, they teamed up with Pierce, Newcomb, Power, Broadwell, and Doolin to plan another train heist. While waiting for the train at the station on June 1, 1892, in Red Rock, Oklahoma, they sensed danger when the train arrived without a light from the wagon window. Quickly, they abandoned their plan and let the train pass without incident. However, shortly after, the second train arrived and they boarded that train. Charlie Bryant and Dick Broadwell kept the engineer and the firefighter in the locomotive, while Bob, Emmett, and Bill Power made their way through the carriages carrying jewelry and cash. Bill Doolin and Grat Dalton took the express train, throwing the safe off the train. The loot in hand, the robbers left, only to find out that their efforts were not paying off much, as the safe contained only about $50. They later discovered that their suspicions were correct about the train they had passed because it was filled with armed guards guarding Sack and Fox's $70,000 annuity. Apparently not satisfied with their arrest in June, they planned another boat robbery on July 14, 1892, at Pryor Creek, Indian Territory. When they arrived at the station, they first took what they could find from the courier and baggage rooms, then sat calmly waiting for the train to arrive, pistols resting on their knees. Once again, the train was full of second-in-commands, but somehow they were all behind the train. The group backed one car into the express car and unloaded all their belongings, easily overpowering the armed guards on the express. When the police finally discovered the theft, a fierce gun battle broke out, in which 2 guards were killed, along with an innocent bystander and another wounded. The group escaped unharmed and took home $17,000 in cash. After this train robbery, a reward of $5,000 was given to each member of the Dalton family. With hot legislation, the Dalton gang disbanded in a short time. But soon they start planning another heist. This will be the biggest heist ever. In early October 1892, brothers Bob, Grat, and Emmett Dalton, with Bill Power and Dick Broadwell, set off for Coffeyville, Kansas. Arriving on the evening of October 4 at P. L. Davis, 4 miles west of Coffeyville, they camped overnight and prepared for the next day. Early in the morning of October 5, 1892, 5 outlaws arrived at Coffeyville shortly after 9 a.m. to find the streets of the city overflowing with people. Tying their horses to an alley in front of the river, they dismounted and went down the alley, 3 in front and 2 behind. The outlaws, disguised with fake beards, split into 2 groups, Grat, Power, and Broadwell entering the C.M. Bank. Condon and Company and Bob and Emmett crossed the square into First National Bank. Disguised or not, as they exited the alley, they passed within 5 feet of a man named Alec McKenna, who recognized one of them as a member of the Dalton family. He watched the men as they entered the bank, and when he saw a gun pointed at the counter of the Condon Bank, he shouted the bank is being robbed. The screams rang out and quickly spread to everyone around the square. Without wasting time, the townsfolk quickly armed themselves from the metal shop and took up positions to defend the town. Inside Condon Bank, there is C.T. Carpenter, one of the owners, Tom C. Babb, accountant, and Charles M. Ball, the cashier. They were quickly taken hostage by the outlaws and ordered to return the money. But the cashier Ball told them that the safe had a timer lock and could not be opened for another 10 minutes. Great, Power, and Broadwell are tricked into waiting, giving the townspeople more time to arm themselves. Meanwhile, at First National Bank, Bob and Emmett capture Thomas G. Ayers, the cashier, W. Shepard and B. S. Ayers, the accountants who they are forced to collect. The Dalton brothers first tried to escape through the front door using 3 bankers as shields. But when the townspeople shot at them, they decided to use the back door. As they waited at the Condon Bank, bullets began to fly through the bank's windows, and Grat, Broadwell, and Power darted out of the bank and into the square. All 3 were hit by bullets as they ran towards the alley. Bob and Emmett ran around a block, stopping long enough to kill 2 citizens, and entered the alley at the same time Grat and the others arrived. Hiding behind a barrel of oil, Grat fired several times as John J. Clower, Carrie Seaman, and Marshall Connolly followed them down the alley. Grat shot and killed Field Marshal Connolly. Someone punched Bob Dalton. He sat up, fired multiple shots aimlessly, collapsed, and died. John Clower shot the wounded Grat with a bullet in the neck, dead current in dust about 3 meters away. Already mortally wounded, Broadwell mounted and rode half a mile to safety before falling from his saddle and dying on the road. Emmett, who was carrying a bag of money, tried to cycle but was shot in the right hand, left hip, and groin. He then turned back to his brother Bob, and as he leaned toward him, Carrie Seaman unloaded both barrels of his shotgun into Emmett's back, and Emmett fell into the driveway. Emmett then raised his hand unharmed and surrendered. He was taken to Dr. Wells' office with 20 bullets, and the doctor said he would die before dark. However, 21-year-old Emmett survived. The gunfight lasted less than 15 minutes after the robbers stormed the bank. 8 people died and 3 were injured. In addition to the 4 outlaws killed, 4 local men were also killed, including Field Marshal Charles Connolly, Lucius Baldwin, George Cubine, and Charles Brown. Emmett was tried and sentenced to life in prison. However, thanks in part to friends on the side of the law who believed he could not escape redemption, Emmett was pardoned in 1907. On September 1, 1908, Emmett married Julia Johnson Gilstrap Lewis in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, where they lived for several years before moving to California. In California, Emmett worked as a construction contractor and later wrote a book about the Dalton Gang's exploits called When the Daltons Rode. Written in collaboration with Jack Jungmeyer, a journalist from Los Angeles, the book was published in 1931. In May 1931, Emmett and Julia returned to Coffeyville for a visit, where they were treated like celebrities. Emmett died at his home in Long Beach, California on July 13, 1937. In 1940, shortly after Emmett's death, the book was adapted into a Western starring Randolph Scott, Broderick Crawford, Andy Devine, and Kay Francis. Julia Dalton participated in the filming as a technical consultant. She then went to Coffeyville, Kansas for the film's premiere. Coffeyville is not the end for the Dalton Gang. 3 members of the old gang are still free: Bill Doolin, Bitter Creek Newcomb, and Charlie Pierce. In fact, many historians believe that Bill Doolin was the 6th member of the gang that attacked Coffeyville, keeping the horses in the driveway, and the only member to escape. Bill Dalton also joins former members of the gang, and they will terrorize the territories for several years as the infamous Doolin-Dalton Gang. On the final fate of the other gang members, George Bitter Creek Newcomb met a 15-year-old girl named Rosa Dunn, known by the nickname Rose of Cimarron. He eventually sought refuge on his parents' farm, and his brothers reported that he received a $5,000 reward for his head. He was shot by the Vice Marshal of the United States on May 2, 1894, in Oklahoma. Charlie Pierce was with George Bitter Creek Newcomb and was also killed by the Vice Marshal of the United States on May 2, 1894, in Oklahoma. Bill Doolin was killed by U.S. Vice Marshal Heck Thomas in August 1896, near Lawson, Oklahoma. Bill Dalton fled after robbing First National Bank in Longview, Texas, and was killed by attorney Loss Hart in Elk, Oklahoma, on June 7, 1894. Blackface Charlie Bryant was arrested by U.S. Vice Marshal Edward Short in the summer of 1891, and while being transferred to federal court in Wichita, Kansas on August 3, 1891, Bryant stole a gun and shot at Marshal Short. The officer returned fire, and when the smoke cleared, both men were dead. Daltons, the robber gang, meet their Waterloo in Coffeyville. The Outlaws beaten at their own game. Headline on the Coffeyville Journal on Friday, October 7, 1892.